As we wrap up the year 2021 and enter the new year, we look around the world and ask ourselves, are there more causes for celebration or concern? Apparently, COVID-19 has amplified the uneven development and inequalities around the world. According to the World Bank, there are still 700 million people living in absolute poverty. When poverty threatens progress, what about human rights? How do people in different countries, in different stages of development and different cultural settings understand human rights differently? And what can countries draw from China's experiences? Welcome to this special edition of The Point with me, Ruijun, coming to you from the sub-forum of the South-South Human Rights Dialogue that's brought to you by the State Council Information Office and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the People's Republic of China. It is also organized by the CGTN think tank. My name is Ruijun, and I'm greatly privileged to have a wonderful panel of guests from around the world joining us for this panel discussion. Without much ado, let me introduce them to you. They are Professor Ruijun, Professor of Institute of International Law at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. Welcome to The Point. Ms. Sandrea Falconer, former Minister of Information of Jamaica, joining us online. Welcome to The Point. Ms. Francesca Hanshing, a former official of the Chilean Education Ministry. She is now doing business here in China. Daniel Oloo, a Ph.D. scholar on international relations with the Communications University of China. He is from Kenya. Welcome. Professor Zhang, who is Executive Deputy Director of the Human Rights Research Institute at China University of Political Science and Law. Welcome, Professor Zhang. Long time no see. And last but definitely not least, Professor Zwart, Professor of Cross-Cultural Law at Utrecht University and Director of the Cross-Cultural Human Rights Center of Free University in Amsterdam. He's joining us via Zoom. Welcome, Professor Zwart, to The Point. So, we are officially looking at this topic, which is a very important one, human rights. And we want to look at it from a global perspective, meaning not just according to the Western liberal ideas of how democracy and human rights can be conducted and developed, but how do people from around the world, especially the global south, look at this? As I said, when countries face different stages of development, when countries have different cultural background and developmental circumstances, how do they see the issue of human rights differently? Do they see this issue differently? And I would like to give the floor to Professor Dai first.
Okay, thank you, Ruijun. It's very honorable having me here. Yes, as you just said, the countries in different stages of development may indeed have different understanding about what is human rights. For the developed countries, they have experienced the rapid economic development and accumulated a lot of wealth and occupied a lot of resources. But in my opinion, maybe this process is not so glorious because most of them are a lot of plunge and aggression. For those countries, they may emphasize more on the civil and political rights, such as the right to vote, the right to be elected, the freedom of expression, etc. Actually, for quite a long time, even today, some countries, such as the United States, do not consider the economic, social, and cultural rights are human rights. It doesn't mean they have good record on economic, social, cultural rights, but they do not consider they have the obligation to safeguard these rights. As you just mentioned, the COVID-19 pandemic, like a mirror, it reflects their disregard of the right to life and the right to health. And it also magnified the inequality between the rich and the poor and the black and the white. And for the developing countries, most of them have experienced and the victim of aggression or colonization. And in some least developed countries, people even suffer from hunger and extreme poverty. So if people have little to eat and dressed in rags, how could they talk about the good education, the colorful culture, the effective exercise of political rights. So for the developing countries, they may emphasize more on the economic, social, and cultural rights, especially the right to development. Actually, in 2017, the United Nations Human Rights Council put forward a new proposition, the contribution of development to the enjoyment of all human rights. Actually, development and human rights are interdependent and reinforced. Human rights is not only the starting point, but also the end, and must be the end of development. And development itself is a very effective approach to safeguard human rights in broadest way. As we all know, poverty weakens all human rights. That is why eradication of poverty has become the primary goal of the 2030 SDG. China made great efforts to reduce and get rid of poverty. To the end of 2020, China has completed the eradication of extreme poverty, let 1/5 of the population live a decent life with dignity. I think it is undeniable that this is a significant contribution to the human rights progress. I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Dai. However, some people believe that to improve people's political rights is the way to improve their developmental rights. Maybe there is a discussion to be had there, but let me go to our Jamaican guest, Sandrea Falconer, who is former Minister of Information of Jamaica. She has had rich experience in journalism, and she is an expert in China-Africa relations as well, and she's joining us from Kingston, Jamaica. So, Sandrea, please give us your perspective on the same question, whether developing countries or countries with different stages of development view human rights differently.
Well, I think when people are struggling to survive, sometimes human rights takes a back seat. And, you know, I was just reading this week that in Afghanistan, there are 24 million people now who are in desperate need of food. And when people need to eat, when they're hungry, human rights doesn't always take priority. And I think that one of the things that we have to look at, how as an entire body of the world, that we can find ways to help those countries like Afghanistan, like Yemen, that are struggling to feed their people. How do we help them? That has to be the first stage. You take care of their basic needs. We ensure that at least people can have basic rights to food, to health care. And then from there, we can focus on other human rights issues. But I think if people are hungry, people are not going to care whether somebody has certain rights. All they want to do is to ensure that they can eat. I can give you some of our own Jamaican experience. We are coming from a slavery society. For over 200 years, we were an enslaved people through the British. And when we got our independence in 1962, the per capita income was less than $500 US. And over time, and with our tourism industry in particular, which has contributed significantly to our economic growth, we have been able to move that per capita income from under $500 to more than $5,000. It's still not where we want to be, but when people can eat, when people have food to eat, when people are comfortable, we can focus on other issues. And Jamaica has a significant track record of rights for women, rights in the 1970s, when we came out of the British rule. Children who were born out of wedlock were not even considered equal. But as time went on, we enacted laws that made every single Jamaican equal. So I say all of that, I give you my Jamaican experience and our Jamaican experience to say the first priority that as a world and as a body, we have to look at those countries in the world that are struggling to feed their people, are struggling to provide them with basic sanitation, basic health care, and we have to give them a hand up. And that's where we begin the process of human rights. Poverty, to me, is one of the greatest assaults on human rights.
Very, very touching story, I would say, and very personal as well. And I think that reflects the kind of different understanding people around the world have about this concept. Because a lot of people believe that when you go to vote, or you're talking about human rights, but when you're earning bread, or when you're helping people earn bread, you are not necessarily improving human rights. It's a very interesting perspective. Next, let me go to Francesca. You were with the Chilean Ministry of Education before, but you have been working very actively in developing business projects in commercial, educational, and cultural fields in China since 2011.
Yes.
So you have both knowledge about your country's perspective and how China sees this subject. What is your perspective?
Well, thank you very much for inviting me tonight. It's interesting because I've been participating in the forum during the day and listening people from different part of the world with different perspective, understanding that most of the country will perceive human rights depend on the own needs. If it's developed, if it's not developed, right? But at the end of the day, normal people don't think about that. People tend to think, like this lady from Jamaica, if they don't have food, probably it won't be in my head what human right is not being fulfilled. I think if at the end of the day they feel that their basic needs are not fulfilled, their sense of wellness also will make them feel that they're not taking part of the society. It's important for a good program, a good for government to understand how can make the people understand human rights. Also, it's important for them to make them feel part of the society. At the end of the day, as I said before, if they feel protected, if they feel that the government can give them the basic, and from that they can work, they can have a leisure time with their families, right? And they can consume. They want to consume too, right? I think people in government needs to think more about the sense of wellness of people.
It is a big thing that people feel that their needs, their basic needs are being met, and that is very, very important. Sometimes we underestimate the significance of that. Mr. Oloo, coming from the Kenyan background and studying in China, how do people, authorities, or the public discourse describe the importance of human rights in the Kenyan background?
Thank you, Ms. Liu. When we talk about development and developing poverty and human rights issues, these are like Siamese twins. You cannot separate one from the other one in this sense. For instance, when we talk about development in Africa, we are talking about infrastructural development. We are talking about economic development. We want our youth to have employment. We want women also to be protected as well. So these are some of the issues we people are focusing on in terms of development. But again, when you go further and look at issues to do with human rights, currently many African countries are being affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. So the question here is, are we going to lock down our country, our citizens, so that we may be able to protect them from this disease? Or are we going to say it is their human right to be able to go out, to freely express themselves, to continue working, and in major incidences, you may see them getting the disease. So This is kind of questions which we always ask ourselves and say, where is the end of human rights issue, and where is the start of development? COVID-19 pandemic has shown us that we need to work as a team. We need to work in partnership. We only work in partnership to be able to continue developing. But if you're not going to take this path, we may end up also lagging behind. If you look at, again, these terms, developing, development, or developed under political discourse, these are also what I always call discourse power, where developed countries will want to impose some particular terminologies to small countries and say, because you people, you are in a process of going far to develop, maybe in this kind of scenario, you are violating human rights. So it becomes also an issue where we need to scrutinize and ask ourselves, where do we stop human rights? Where do we start understanding the concept of human rights? For us, we believe that it is contextual. Human rights in China is totally different from human rights in Kenya and the rest of the world.
Okay, very interesting perspective. I think you also wanted to say that sometimes human rights is used as a tool instead of what it should be for international political gains or power play. But I hope to be able to touch upon some of the points you just made. Does human rights end? You know, what is really the relationship between human rights and development and international politics? But many thanks. Let me move on to Professor Zhang. You have been studying human rights for a very long time. And now China has been, you know, gradually lifting its living standard, its development level to still being part of the developing country, but, you know, more as an emerging country and taking a greater position in, you know, in international affairs and international public discourse. How do you look at China's understanding of human rights nowadays? Has it changed from the past? Is it different from other countries?
I think Chinese government has been very clear for a long time that we uphold the UN human rights standards. That means that we share the same understanding of human rights with most countries of this world. But we are in different development stage. We may have different priorities in developing our human rights and freedoms. For that reason, in the early 90s, we had a policy to focus to make our focus on the development of the right to development, and to make sure that our economic development is able to produce a result to help promote the human rights and freedoms. If you look back to these 30 years of development, we realize that was probably a very good choice. For example, if you take education, for example, for a very long time, our education investment on the GDP percent is very low. It's between 1 or 2% of GDP. But with the development of economy, we are able to increase our development, our education investment up to more than 4%. That's not a very big percentage if you look at the number, but it takes a very long time to be able to reach that level. And it also shows determination of this government and Chinese Communist Party to improve the level. Also, if you look at the poverty, since 2012, President Xi Jinping has been very clear to fight against poverty with various measures. And every time when he traveled to different provinces, maybe you'll notice that he always goes to different families, especially the poor family, to make sure that they are able to get help to fight against poverty. So there are different focus or strategy at a different period of time. And by doing that, China is able to fully promote our human rights and freedoms. So we also aim to have a better future. That is what President Xi Jinping has been saying, that we're trying to improve the whole happiness and wellness for the whole people without any distinction, without any discrimination.
Okay, thank you very much to Professor Zhang. Next, let me go to our guest joining us from Amsterdam, Professor Zwart. You are a representative here of the more developed world, but you do cross-cultural human rights studies, so I'm sure you'll be able to speak from a broader perspective. What is your understanding of the difference? Is there a difference in the view of human rights between countries of different development stage?
Thank you so much, Ruijun. It's a great pleasure to be on your program, which we can also watch in Europe. Well, our focus actually is on the human rights perception in the Global South, and I can tell you a little bit about what, according to our view, is wrong with the Northern approach to human rights. And I would like to use the COVID-19 crisis as an example. We have seen recently that Southern African experts have been able to identify the new Omicron variant of the virus. And as a reward for their efforts, now all traffic to and from South Africa has been disrupted. And that's, of course, not the way forward, to exclude countries which are performing very well at this level. And President Xi has already said, he has launched the perspective of building a community of shared future for mankind, that states, when they pursue their own interests, they should also take the interests of other states into account. And of course, this is very important as far as COVID-19 is concerned. Countries in the Global North are now stockpiling vaccines, and they should stop doing so. And they should share them with countries in the Global South, as China and Russia, of course, all are already doing. And of course, it's in their own interest as well. As soon as every person in the world has been vaccinated, then the virus will be beaten. I would also like to give you another example. It has already been mentioned by Mrs. Falconer. It's the situation in Afghanistan. As you know, people in Afghanistan are facing a humanitarian disaster. And therefore, the Taliban government has requested northern countries like the US to defreeze their accounts, which are frozen in these northern countries, to be able to beat this humanitarian disaster. But these countries refuse to do so. And apparently they do so because they feel that the Taliban government should pursue a more gender equality approach. And of course, many people in the world will welcome that, but you should not push that particular perspective at the expense of human life and by holding a country hostage. So in my view, the time has now come for human rights perceptions and concepts from the Global South to get more prominence at the international level. We should stop investing in the self-interest of putting our own country first, which is very much a northern perspective, but put emphasis on the brotherhood of nations and the brotherhood of people, which has been included in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights at the initiative of the Chinese delegate Zhang in 1948. And to raise the voice of the Global South as far as human rights is concerned, I would propose to set up a think tank, a South-South human rights think tank that would give a louder voice to Southern voices, to Southern ideas in the human rights debate. And in that way, probably it will be better that the whole human rights community and the international community can benefit more from the insights, the very welcome insights from the Global South on human rights.
Many thanks to Professor Zwart for those insights, extremely timely and very important points as well. I just want to go back to Professor Zhang, because right now you talked about the particularities of China's human rights philosophy and our focuses, but is China's understanding of human rights different from that of developed countries in North America, in Europe?
I think even between the West, they share different views. For example, U.S. government has been always upholding civil political rights as human rights, but never accept the economic, social, cultural rights as human rights. But I think European states are more, close to the UN standards. They pay attention to the human rights, not only on civil political rights, but also on economic, social, cultural rights. As to China, I think we also try to balance, and we uphold the UN standards, as I said before, to treat all the rights equally and try to promote all the rights at the same time. But we may have different strategy at different period of time.
I'm afraid we have to leave it there. Time is up. Thank you so much to Professor Ruijun, to Francesca Hanshing, to Daniel Oloo, to Professor Zhang Wei, to Professor Tom Zwart, and definitely to Sandrea Falconer for joining us for this very special edition on South-South Human Rights Dialogue and Cooperation. And with that, we come to the end of this special edition of The Point with me, Luixin. As always, you can follow me on Facebook and Twitter using the handle Luixin in Beijing. Thanks for watching, and you've got the point.